I came for a 2-day conference, and what am I? I'm a teacher. I am an educator. I'm a researcher. I'm an advocate. I'm a speaker, and so I'm very fortunate to be able to travel around and get to tell stories and hear stories, and so that's what I'm here for these 2 days. Yeah.
And why do you do what you do, or why is it important what you do?
So the reason why I feel like this is important, or why I do what I do, for a couple of reasons. I started because my own experience as a student, I really struggled. And so when I first started to get into inclusive education, it was to work with kids like me. But what that kind of turned into was I realized that, when I started to shift from kind of learning disabilities to developmental disabilities, that a lot of schools were missing out on the opportunity to learn with people with disabilities. And I feel like it's a real disservice to people to not learn from the diversity of ability. And then what it kind of turned into is because I never really felt like I had a strength in terms of, because of my own learning disability. And then when I started speaking, I'm just like, hey, I like this and I'm good at this. And that's only become recent. And so it's kind of become something that I love, something that I'm good at, something that I feel like I'm making an impact. And I know that that doesn't always happen to everybody to have that trifecta. So I feel pretty lucky to be doing all those things because it's something I really believe in, for sure.
Cool. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. And now I can include you both. And did you want to?
Like you were in the conference today, you were talking about one identity, and I'm very close with that topic.
Yeah.
And just would like for you to explain disability and identity to the people.
Oh, to the people. I think that one thing I realized very early in education is that we're really supportive of identity and diversity, but we don't see disability as identity. We see it as a deficit. And something that I've learned over time, especially as I'm learning more about critical disability studies and people that I work with, is that disability isn't a deficit at all. It's a part of who we are, and it's a part of our identity, and it's not about changing it, it's about learning from it. And I think that when you look at disability that way, you realize how important it is to have in your life. And so when we're advocating for inclusion, it's not about replacing the time that we get to spend together when we're the same,
right,
but it is about really considering the criteria we use for groupings, because coming together based on identity is totally different than putting kids together based on deficit. And I think that's a really big misunderstanding in school, because oftentimes we'll close down a lot of our identity spaces to be inclusive, but that's not the goal at all. Like, we need both. We need opportunities to be together.
Right, because I always thought, in my experiences, when you put somebody in an integrated classroom, you have 25 people without disabilities and one person with a disability that doesn't feel comfortable at all.
And I think that like forcing people together for the sake of a policy is kind of defeating the purpose as much as preventing them from going in the first place. And I think that the only way that those classrooms can be inclusive isn't by saying, oh, look at us, we're including someone who's different, but actually acknowledging that a person with a disability is different just like everybody is different, and it's looking at the diversity as a whole, as opposed to, oh, look at us including someone with a disability. Like, it's not what it's about. It's about acknowledging ability and disability as a part of diversity. And that's actually what all of the kids have in common. Right?
Cool.
But we're on the same page, my friend. I saw you give a pound earlier. I want one.
There you go. My next question would definitely be, now you were talking about how the education system, and you have the integration, the segregation, and the inclusion. Could that same aspect, well, I know that same aspects can happen in the service system. How would you implement that structure that you talked about today?
You know, it's so interesting, because the more I research this, the more I realize it's not about education. It's so much bigger. It's about community. And if you kind of break down, because the 4 things we looked at today was presuming competence, it was that you had access, that you have connection, and that you have purpose. And those 4 big ideas, you could apply to a classroom, or you could apply to a community center, you could apply to a grocery store, like all of those things. And I think the more I learn about this, the more I'm like, this isn't an educational framework, this is a life framework, right? Like a family could use this, a doctor's office could use this, a family center could use this, because all of us need those 4 things. All of us do, regardless of what our ability levels are, our culture, our language. And it's really exciting because I think the more that we can see what we have in common, the less fragmented we'll be, and the more we can like kind of work together.
Now, I asked you this question off camera. Yeah. But I will ask you on camera. I'm ready. How accessible is Vancouver?
Vancouver is so accessible. I will even tell you, when I moved there, our mayor was in a full motorized wheelchair. He was a quadriplegic, and absolutely. And so, if you watch the Olympics, when they passed the flag to our mayor in Russia, they had to make the Olympic venue accessible because the mayor is quadriplegic, and so they had to make sure that the mayor could receive the flag. So they had a whole like attachment for his chair so that he could accept the flag for Canada. Wow. Yeah. So Vancouver, I'm pretty proud of Vancouver for our accessibility for sure. And it's a newer part of the world, like newly developed, and so a lot of policy that came into place to make buildings accessible. The buildings were built after that, and so like I don't think I have ever seen a building built within the last 20 years that doesn't design for accessibility from the start. It has to, right?
Now, I was in Toronto for the International Film Festival. Yes. And I've been going there for the past few years, and a couple of things I noticed is more people with various disabilities out in the public, not being hidden. Like when you're in America, you might see 1 or 2 people with disabilities walking on the street. And in Canada, you might see 10 to 15 people with disabilities coming down the street. How do you feel about the way that people with disabilities are being included in this society?
That's a good question. I think in terms of Canada as a whole, sometimes it's even different from province to province. And I think
and that's good for you to explain.
Totally, it's different from province to province, but I think like as a whole, Canada has done some really phenomenal things. I think that there's areas that Canada can absolutely improve on. One thing, and the reason why I choose to live in British Columbia is because something that I'm really proud of for BC is they were the first province to close down institutions. They were the first province to move to neighborhood schools. They're the first province to have no segregated schools. And so I think from a systemic structure, there's a value there. And because that's there, it's creating the context for people to live in to not fear disability. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be people who don't understand, but I think that it says something about the infrastructure of some places in Canada that say, no, they're going to be in our school. Cool. And we're going to support them. And you know what? They're going to be on the bus, and we're going to support them. And there isn't another option. And so it's something that I'm very proud of, absolutely. And it's not every province that I can say that about, but I think that creates a huge shift in mindset for people without disabilities to say, you know what? These are citizens like everybody else, and it's not something to fear, but something that's actually a contribution to our society. And I think that I really believe that. And I think that the more that we can support, the community to see the contribution, but also help people with disabilities to see that they have something to offer. Because I think a lot of people with disabilities don't even realize that they have contributions because that's not how they were raised or grown up to believe, right? And so I think, when I work with my students, it's making sure, do kids know their strengths? Do they know they know what they bring? And I think that's a shift that all kids could benefit from.
What I see here, you have lack of access. One of our biggest things in Buffalo, and I would say Rochester, is transportation, either from a city perspective or a rural perspective. How do you look at those kind of things, like housing and transportation, and use that in your education?
When I think about physical access, I don't even think about it anymore, because where I live, it's not even a question. but there is no transportation that's not accessible. I can't even like think of an example. And so, you know, like kind of where I come from is, you know, physical access is advocacy, and I look to intellectual access as advocacy because I feel like that's where we need to go. But I think from the physical perspective, I can't even imagine you not having physical access to a bus.
Yeah.
Like that blows my brain open that you don't, because it seems like such an obvious right.
Well, it's
You
just
know?
that we have this law that says you have paratransit. I know you have like a paratransit system where people with disabilities can get a curb-to-curb service.
But every bus is accessible.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
the thing under the ADA,
Yeah.
a paratransit bus can only go 3/4 of a mile from a regular bus.
What?
Right.
Why?
And that's why we're advocating
Okay.
for
Yeah.
the Western New York Developmental Disability Service Office to be moved.
Right.
But it's been there since the 60s.
Right. Right.
And people just don't want to.
I just don't understand.
Move it.
I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want to move it?
That's the ultimate question.
What? And this is the thing too, is that like often, if you look at the populations that population that's being marginalized,
Yeah.
we're expecting them to like go totally out of their way, and then the people who aren't marginalized are like, it's uncomfortable, and I'm like,
Yeah.
people, it is so easy. It is so easy for the people who are not being marginalized to change.
Yeah.
So how about we just switch those roles?
Right. Because
Yeah.
they don't want to go past 15 to 5 minutes from work. And they're like, we want this to stay here. And some people are like, we provided services to people.
See, if it were up to
Yeah.
me, Sam, I would just be like, too bad, we're moving it. Because it's like, to me, if it's an accessibility issue,
Yeah.
there is no question. There's no question.
Well,
Me and
that's what we
me and
do
you,
it
me
here.
and you, let's just take over. Let's take over the world. Let's become we'll just become all the government people that we need to be like, enough is enough, people. Bus is accessible, buildings accessible, because I don't even know how you can attempt to talk about inclusion if we can't actually get to where we need to go.
True.
Period.
Yes.
Dot. And we want to talk about inclusive in schools, and kids can't even
Not
get to
every
school.
That particular dot. A lot of different dots.
All the time, multiple colors and
Yes.
sizes.
Yes.
Well, you have my support, Sam, 100%.
Just wanted for you to tell the audience
Yeah.
your
Okay.
final thought or statement that you would like to share.
Okay, here's my final thought and statement, and I really believe this 100%. I think both systemically, in terms of physical access, intellectual access, all of the accesses, I think that a big shift that needs to happen, and it's so freeing when you realize this, is that people with disability are not more work. They're not, it's not a burden. We cannot look at this as a burden, because as soon as we start to realize that we're missing, the population is missing out on a fund of knowledge and experience that people who are non-disabled are missing out on.
Right.
There's contributions here that we are actually, it's actually a disservice, I think, to society by not making it accessible in all ways, emotionally, cognitively, historically. And if I was a parent of a kid without a disability, for them to not have access of ability and disability as a diversity, I think is the biggest disservice to kids. And so you could take that in terms of intellectual ability and diversity or physical ability and diversity, and we often see it as policies and rules that we have to follow, as opposed to, this is going to benefit everybody.
Yes.
This is not just for people with disabilities, this is for all people. And once people get that, this is the most cost-effective strategy. This is the most effective, because you have to live it.
I feel like I need
See?
a new friend.
Me and you.
Like, all the way.
No,
like,
we get it.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
Let's keep in touch. Cool.